The air in the armory at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was thick enough to be a physical presence. It was a layered concoction of competing, aggressive scents. The sharp, metallic tang of bore solvent, the deeper, almost organic smell of weapons-grade lubricant, and the ever-present fine grit of Afghan dust that coated everything in a pale, ghostly film. Underneath it all was the low, electric hum of overworked ventilation systems and the distant, throbbing growl of the base's generators, the twin hearts that pumped life into this remote island of military order in a sea of chaos. It was a place of function over form, where every surface was scarred steel or stained concrete, and the only decorations were the stenciled serial numbers on racks of identical M4 carbines and the faded safety posters that warned of dangers no one here needed reminding of. The light was harsh, cast from caged fluorescent tubes that flickered with a nervous, buzzing energy, painting the room in sterile shades of white and deep shadow. This was a place built for the singular purpose of maintaining the tools of war, and it had the soulless, pragmatic atmosphere of a chapel dedicated to a violent god. In a corner, away from the clatter and brusque camaraderie of the armorers conducting their daily inventories, a figure sat on a simple wooden stool. She was unremarkable to the point of being nearly invisible, a study in deliberate anonymity. Her fatigues were standard issue, faded from sun and countless washings, bearing no discernible rank insignia or unit patches. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun that was more about efficiency than style. She was not large, nor was she possessed of the overt, sculpted musculature that characterized many of the soldiers who passed through this place. She was lean, economical in her build, and her movements were so precise, so measured, that they seemed to consume the absolute minimum amount of energy required. She sat hunched over a workbench, her entire universe seemingly condensed into the machine that lay in pieces before her. It was not a standard M4. Even to a layman's eye, the weapon was different. Its lines were sharper, its materials a collage of exotic polymers and alloys that seemed to drink the harsh light rather than reflect it. It was a tool of surgical lethality, and she tended to it with the focused reverence of a master watchmaker. Her hands, slender and unadorned, moved with a liquid grace, dismantling the bolt carrier group, cleaning each component with a small, stiff brush, wiping it with a clean cloth, and laying it out on a canvas mat in a specific, ritualistic order. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She did not look up. She did not seem to breathe. Her concentration was a palpable force, a bubble of intense quiet in the noisy, utilitarian space. She was a fixed point of calm in a world of impending violence. Into this carefully controlled environment strode Colonel Marcus Thorne. He was the antithesis of the woman in the corner. Where she was quiet, he was a cacophony. His boots struck the concrete floor with an aggressive, rhythmic clap that announced his importance before he was even seen. Where her fatigues were faded and anonymous, his were crisp, sharply creased, the camouflage pattern still dark and new. His rank, the silver eagle of a full-bird colonel, was polished to a brilliant shine on his collar, a beacon of authority. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, all sharp angles and a jaw that seemed permanently set in a state of righteous indignation. Colonel Thorne was not a creature of the Forward Operating Base. He was an emissary from the world of polished desks and PowerPoint presentations. A man who believed that the chaos of war could be managed by the sheer force of his own regulations. He radiated authority like heat from a furnace, and he expected the world to bend to his temperature. His eyes swept the armory, taking in the scene with a proprietary air. He was the newly assigned FOB commander, and he was on a tour to impress his standards upon the untidy reality of the front lines. He nodded curtly at the chief armorer, corrected a junior soldier's posture with a sharp word, and then his gaze fell upon the woman in the corner. His eyes narrowed. He saw not a professional at work, but an anomaly, a deviation from the established order he so cherished. He saw a small woman, a civilian perhaps, or some low-ranking specialist, who had no business being in his armory, let alone handling a piece of non-regulation hardware. His mind, a machine built on assumption and prejudice, processed the visual data and arrived at a swift, flawed conclusion. This was a problem to be corrected. Loudly. He strode toward her, his path cleaving through the room's ambient noise. The armorers fell silent, sensing the impending collision of personalities. The hum of the lights seemed to grow louder in the sudden quiet. The colonel stopped directly behind her, casting a long shadow over her workbench. She did not acknowledge his presence. She continued to meticulously clean the firing pin, her focus an impenetrable shield. This perceived insubordination was a lit match to the short fuse of Thorne's temper. He believed respect was a function of rank, an automatic deference owed to the insignia on his collar, not something to be earned through competence or character. Her silence was not a sign of concentration. To him, it was an act of defiance. "Specialist," he began, his voice a low growl designed to intimidate. He intentionally demoted her to the lowest enlisted ranks, a common verbal tactic to establish dominance. She did not respond. She placed the clean firing pin onto the mat and picked up the cam pin, rotating it under the light. Thorne's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the concrete, and leaned down, his voice now a sharp, condescending bark meant for the entire room to hear. "I am speaking to you. Where did you get that rifle?" The question hung in the stale air, heavy with accusation. It was not a query. It was an indictment. It implied theft, impropriety, a violation of his established order. The onlookers, the young soldiers and seasoned non-commissioned officers, watched with a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. They knew the colonel's reputation. They also knew that people who handled weapons that looked like that were rarely simple specialists. A complex and dangerous equation was being written, and no one knew the answer. For a long moment, the woman did not move. It was a stillness so profound it was unnerving, a pocket of absolute zero in the rising heat of the confrontation. Then, slowly, she finished her inspection of the cam pin, placed it gently next to the firing pin, and only then did she turn her head. She did not turn her body, only her head, a minimal, economical movement. Her eyes, which were a pale, indeterminate color, met his. They were utterly flat, devoid of fear or anger or any discernible emotion. They were the eyes of a camera, recording data without judgment. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. Not a whisper, but a precisely modulated tone that carried through the silent room without any effort. It was issued. The answer was a masterpiece of minimalism. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without inflection, without a hint of the deference Thorne's rank demanded. It was a pebble of truth dropped into the churning waters of his ego. It did not placate him. It enraged him. The lack of a groveling apology, the absence of a stammered explanation, the sheer, unadulterated calm of her response. It was a rejection of his entire worldview. He felt the eyes of the other soldiers on him, and his humiliation curdled into fury. He was a colonel. He was not to be dismissed. "Issued," he echoed, his voice dripping with sarcastic disbelief. He straightened up, puffing out his chest, transforming his authority into a physical display. Issued by whom? I am Colonel Marcus Thorne, the commanding officer of this installation. All non-standard weapon systems require my personal written authorization. I have signed no such authorization. I have seen no such request. So I will ask you again, and I expect a better answer this time. Who issued you that rifle? He punctuated each word with a jab of his finger toward the weapon on her bench. He had escalated, turning a question into a direct public challenge. He was no longer just inquiring, he was prosecuting. The woman's gaze flickered from his eyes to the jabbing finger, then back. A flicker of something, not annoyance, but perhaps analysis, passed through her expression, as if she were classifying his behavior as one might classify an insect. She did not answer his question. Instead, she offered another simple, declarative statement, her voice still unnervingly calm. Your finger is inside the trigger guard of my weapon, Colonel. Thorne froze. He looked down and saw that in his theatrical gesticulation, his index finger had indeed breached the space within the rifle's trigger guard. It was a rookie mistake, a cardinal sin of weapon safety that every recruit had drilled into them from the first day of basic training. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a hot flush of embarrassment. He snatched his hand back as if the metal were white-hot. The silent armorers, who lived and breathed weapon safety, exchanged almost imperceptible glances. The colonel had just been publicly corrected on the most basic of protocols by the very person he was attempting to discipline. The balance of power in the room had shifted, subtly but seismically. She had not raised her voice. She had not challenged his rank. She had simply stated a fact, and in doing so, had exposed a crack in the foundation of his authority. His authority was based on a rulebook he had just proven he did not fully grasp. Hers, it was becoming clear, was based on something else entirely. Frustrated, his aggression now fueled by public humiliation, Thorne decided to change tactics. If verbal dominance failed, physical presence would suffice. He took another step forward, deliberately invading her personal space, forcing her to lean back slightly to avoid contact. He loomed over her, a physical manifestation of his rank. "Stand up," he commanded, his voice low and guttural. "You will address me with the respect I am owed. You will identify yourself, your unit, and you will explain to me right now what you are doing in my armory with an unauthorized prototype." He reached out, his hand moving to grab the rifle from the bench, to confiscate the evidence of her insubordination. Her movement was almost too fast to see. It was not a strike or a block. It was a fluid, economical shift of her entire body. She rose from the stool, not in response to his command, but in a single flowing motion that simultaneously moved the weapon out of his reach and placed her own body between him and the bench. She did not flinch. She did not turn. She simply was no longer where he expected her to be. He was left grasping at empty air. The sheer grace and speed of the action was breathtaking. It was the movement of a predator, not a victim. A lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, and then reminding it, with a silent twitch of muscle, exactly where that line was drawn. Before Thorne could process this new affront, the world dissolved into chaos. The first explosion was a deep, resonant whoomp that was felt more than heard, a concussive wave that vibrated through the concrete floor and rattled the weapons in their racks. It was the unmistakable gut punch signature of a large vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. The lights in the armory flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness for a terrifying second before the emergency batteries kicked in, casting everything in a hellish, pulsating red glow. A heartbeat later, the sirens began to wail, a rising, falling scream that clawed at the nerves. Then came the sound of the sky tearing apart, the sharp, shrieking whistle of incoming mortar rounds, followed by a series of deafening cracks as they impacted around the base perimeter. The walls of the armory shook, dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Through the open bay doors, the distant pop-pop-pop of small arms fire began to stitch the air, a sound that was rapidly growing closer, more intense. Fob Sentinel was under a complex, coordinated attack. In the crimson gloom, panic began to bloom. The young soldiers, their training kicking in, began moving toward the weapons racks, their movements jerky and uncertain. The NCOs began shouting, trying to impose order on the rising tide of fear. And Colonel Thorne, he began to bellow. He was a man of procedure, and this was an unscheduled event. He started barking orders, but they were the wrong orders, the textbook responses for a conventional assault, not the fluid, asymmetric nightmare that was unfolding. Establish a perimeter at the main gate. I want a platoon of heavy machine guns laid down on the south road. Get the QRF spinning up. Someone get me a line to CENTCOM. His voice was loud, straining to project an authority he no longer felt. He was shouting into a hurricane, his commands swallowed by the roar of the attack and the sheer panic of the moment. He was trying to fit a square peg of doctrine into the round hole of reality, and it was failing disastrously. The soldiers looked at him, their eyes wide with fear, and then looked at their NCOS, searching for a leader who understood the language of this particular brand of hell. Thorne was a commander, but in this moment, he was not a leader. His brand of authority had just been rendered obsolete. The chaos was a living entity, a swirling beast of noise and fear and confusion. The red emergency lights pulsed like a frantic heartbeat, painting scenes of frantic action in disjointed, nightmarish flashes. Men shouted for ammunition, for medics, for orders that made sense. The comms network crackled with panicked, overlapping transmissions, a cacophony of terror that offered no clarity, only a deeper sense of spiraling disaster. Mortar rounds continued to walk their way across the compound, their impacts shaking the very foundations of the world, each explosion a punctuation mark in a sentence of death. Thorne stood in the center of it all, a statue of impotence, his crisp uniform now covered in a fine layer of dust, his parade ground voice lost in the symphony of destruction. He was a man who had brought a rulebook to a knife fight, and he was watching his world get carved to pieces. Then, through the maelstrom, came a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was small, precise, and utterly incongruous with the surrounding pandemonium. It was the crisp, metallic click-clack of a bolt being seated in a perfectly maintained weapon. Every head in the armory, including Thorne's, turned toward the source of the sound. The woman, the specialist, the anomaly, stood by her workbench. She had reassembled her rifle in the flickering red darkness with the unhurried calm of someone doing a crossword puzzle. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming figure from the corner. A transformation had occurred. The stillness was still there, but it was no longer passive. It was the coiled, patient stillness of a viper ready to strike. The anonymity had burned away, replaced by an aura of absolute terrifying competence. She moved. Her previous motion had been a defensive shift. This was an assertion of purpose. She walked to a hardened communications locker in the corner of the armory, a box Thorne hadn't even known was active. She didn't try the handle. She tapped a 5-digit code into a keypad he hadn't noticed was there. The locker hissed open. Inside was not standard radio gear, but a sleek, custom-built comms suite with a single, odd-looking headset. She put it on, the microphone a thin black line against her cheek. She didn't grab a helmet or body armor from the common supply. She pulled her own lightweight, high-cut helmet from the locker, along with a minimalist plate carrier that was clearly custom-fitted. She geared up with the same fluid efficiency she had shown at the workbench, her movements a ballet of deadly preparation. Thorne watched, dumbfounded. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He managed to sputter, his authority now sounding like a petulant whine. She turned to him. The flat, emotionless look in her eyes was gone. In its place was something far more frightening, a look of pure, cold, analytical focus. It was the look of a surgeon about to make the first incision. "My job, Colonel," she said, her voice still quiet, but now it cut through the noise like a scalpel. "I suggest you find a hole and stay in it. You're a liability." She turned her back on him, a dismissal so total it was like a physical blow. She tapped her earpiece, and then she began to speak. It was a language that no one in the room understood, but they recognized it as the native tongue of command. It was not the blustering, insecure shouting of Thorne. It was a calm, rapid-fire stream of information, directives, and lethal intent. "Sunray, this is Nightfall," she said, her voice a low, controlled monotone. The call sign hung in the air, alien and ominous. "I confirm, we are at Condition Black. The package is compromised. I am invoking Protocol Chimera. Repeat, Chimera is a go." A pause, then she continued. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. "Execute Cascade 7. First priority is the southern approach. They're using the Wadi for cover. I need aerial denial, danger close. Target designators are laser on target from my position. Priority grid 349er, elevation 20, splash in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. As she said 1, a sound ripped through the sky above them, a terrifying shriek unlike any conventional aircraft. It was the sound of something moving impossibly fast. It was followed by a series of deep, guttural thumps from outside, explosions that felt different, more focused, more violent than the random mortar impacts. A soldier who had taken cover near the bay door risked a look outside. His jaw went slack. "Holy," he breathed. Whatever that was, it just vaporized the entire wadi. The woman, Nightfall, didn't even acknowledge it. She was already moving on to the next part of her violent symphony. Her eyes were unfocused, looking past the walls of the armory, seeing a battlefield that only she had access to. She began issuing orders to the shell-shocked soldiers in the room, but she was not asking, she was tasking. Her authority was not based on the rank on her collar, but on the undeniable evidence of her competence. "You," she said, pointing a finger at a stunned-looking sergeant. "Third-story window of the barracks, east-facing. You have a sniper team setting up. You have 30 seconds to suppress that position before they acquire a target. Use the M240. Go. Now." The sergeant, a combat veteran with 3 tours under his belt, simply blinked, then nodded, a lifetime of training recognizing a true commander when he heard one. He grabbed his machine gunner, and they sprinted out into the chaos. Less than 20 seconds later, the heavy, rhythmic chugging of the M240 echoed across the compound, followed by the distant tinkle of broken glass. She turned to another group. The VBIED at the main gate was a feint. The primary breach is coming from the north, through the wire they cut during the mortar barrage. They're coming heavy. I need 2 fire teams to reinforce that position. Move along the west wall. The East is an open kill zone. She never raised her voice. She never repeated an order. She spoke with the calm certainty of a chess grandmaster dictating the final moves of a game she had won before it even began. And the soldiers, from the lowest private to the most seasoned NCO, obeyed without question. They had been given clarity in the chaos, a voice of pure, unadulterated capability. They moved with a purpose they hadn't possessed moments before, galvanized by her leadership. Then, she brought her own rifle up. It settled into her shoulder as if it were an extension of her own body. She moved to the edge of the bay door, using the massive steel frame as cover. She looked out into the fire-swept darkness, her head canting back and forth. Thorn, who had crept closer, mesmerized by the display, could not see what she was looking at. He saw only smoke, muzzle flashes, and terror. But she saw something else. She saw the geometry of the battle. Her rifle cracked. It was not the full-throated roar of an M4. It was a single, sharp, impossibly loud report, like a massive whip cracking, a single round. A moment of silence. Then, over her headset, Thorn could just faintly hear a voice. "Good hit, Nightfall. Target down." She fired again. Another single, precise crack. Another confirmation in her ear. She was not engaging in suppressive fire. She was performing surgery. Each round was a specific solution to a specific problem. She was dismantling the enemy attack, piece by piece from the inside out, with a weapon no one had ever seen, on a network no one knew existed, under a call sign that was pure myth. Colonel Thorn stood frozen, his world completely unmade. The foundations of his understanding, of rank, of order, of authority, had been pulverized into dust. He was no longer the commander of this base. He was a spectator. He was a witness to a level of martial artistry so far beyond his comprehension that it felt like magic. The woman he had tried to humiliate, the specialist he had threatened, was single-handedly orchestrating the defense of his entire command, and she was doing it with a calm, lethal grace that was both terrifying and beautiful. The battle for Ephob's Sentinel raged on, but the crisis in the armory was over. A new authority had asserted itself, not through rank or regulation, but through the undeniable, incandescent power of pure competence. The fury of the assault broke like a wave against a granite cliff. The initial shock and awe of the complex attack was met and systematically dismantled by a defense that seemed clairvoyant. The shrieking, unseen aircraft, drones, Thorn's panicked mind supplied, but faster and more agile than any he knew, had neutralized the enemy's heavy support. The ground teams, guided by the woman's preternaturally calm voice, had met the infiltration attempts not at the point of breach, but at the staging areas, ambushing the ambushers. The enemy sniper teams were eliminated before they could fire a single meaningful shot. The attack, which should have overwhelmed the base in minutes, faltered, broke, and then dissolved into a panicked retreat. The entire engagement, from the first VBIED to the last fading echoes of rifle fire, lasted 17 minutes. A strange, ringing silence descended upon the FOB, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant, urgent shouts of medical teams. The red emergency lights in the armory still pulsed, casting their bloody glow on the scene of the colonel's undoing. The soldiers who had been given their orders by the woman called Nightfall began to filter back in, their faces a mixture of adrenaline-fueled excitement, shock, and a new, profound sense of awe. They looked at her not as a colleague, but as something other, something legendary. She, for her part, seemed unchanged. She was methodically clearing her rifle, her movements just as precise as they had been before the world had ended and been remade. She stripped the weapon down on its canvas mat, the scent of burnt cordite now mingling with the smell of solvent. The crisis was over. Her work was done. The quiet professional had returned to her quiet professionalism. It was into this tableau of stunned silence and dawning reverence that a new force arrived. The thumping beat of rotor blades grew from a distant whisper to a deafening roar, and a pair of Black Hawk helicopters, flying low and fast without lights, settled onto the main landing pad in a maelstrom of dust and displaced air. The rear ramp of the lead helicopter dropped before the skids had even fully settled, and a figure emerged, flanked by two massive, heavily armed commandos. The figure was a man who needed no introduction. Even in the dim, chaotic light, his silhouette was unmistakable. General Mathis was a two-star general, the overall commander of coalition forces in the theater, a man whose face was on every strategic brief and whose reputation preceded him like a shockwave. He was known for his volcanic temper and his utter intolerance for incompetence. He strode into the armory, his face a thundercloud of fury. His command post had been in a communications blackout, and he had come to his forwardmost base to find out why it had nearly been wiped off the map. "Who is in command here?" Mathis boomed, his voice accustomed to shaking rooms much larger than this one. His eyes, burning with cold fire, swept across the faces of the assembled soldiers, dismissing them all as inadequate. He saw the shell-shocked NCOs, the wide-eyed privates, and then he saw Colonel Marcus Thorne. "Thorne, report! What the hell happened here? My entire intelligence network went dark. The last I heard, this base was being overrun." Thorne, who had been struggling to reassemble the shattered pieces of his authority, snapped to attention, his movements stiff and clumsy. "General, we were hit by a complex attack. VBIED, mortars, ground assault. We repelled them." His voice was thin, unconvincing. He sounded like a man trying to take credit for a sunrise. General Mathis was not convinced. His eyes narrowed, continuing their sweep of the room. He was a man who had survived decades of combat and bureaucracy by reading the truth in the spaces between words, in the postures of his subordinates. He saw the way the other soldiers were not looking at Thorne. He saw the awe on their faces, and he saw that it was all directed toward one corner of the room. His gaze followed theirs, and then he saw her. The transformation that came over General Mathis was instantaneous and absolute. The thundercloud of rage on his face did not just dissipate, it was annihilated, replaced by an expression of such profound and immediate respect that it stunned every person in the room. His back, which had been bowed with aggression, straightened. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, relaxed. The two-star general, the supreme commander of an entire theater of war, took a half-step forward and then snapped himself to the most rigid, parade ground perfect position of attention Thorne had ever seen. It was the salute of a subordinate to a superior, a gesture of deference so complete it defied all logic of rank and protocol. "Ma'am," Mathis's voice was sharp, clear, and utterly respectful. "Apologies for the intrusion. We had a total comms blackout at HQ. Your network was the only thing broadcasting out of this sector. We came as soon as we saw your signal." The entire room held its breath. The collective minds of 24 soldiers tried and failed to process what they were seeing. A two-star general was standing at attention for an anonymous woman with no rank insignia. Colonel Thorne's mouth hung slightly agape, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending bewilderment. He finally found his voice, a strangled, confused whisper. "General, you know this woman." Mathis turned his head slowly, fixing Thorne with a gaze that was colder, and more dangerous than any mortar round. The contempt in that look was a weapon in itself. "Colonel," the general said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl, "you are standing in the presence of Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed. Do you know what that means?" He didn't wait for an answer. "It means you are in the company of a living legend. Some people in the intelligence community call her the Oracle of Kandahar. The operators she works with just call her Nightfall." The name, her real name and rank, descended on the room like a bomb. Chief Warrant Officer 5. The highest, most revered, and rarest of the warrant officer ranks. They were the silent masters of the military, the technical and tactical savants who existed in a realm beyond the conventional chain of command. They were advisors to generals, living repositories of institutional knowledge. And Evelyn Reed, it was now terrifyingly clear, was one of them. General Mathis wasn't finished. He took a step toward Thorne, his voice a litany of the colonel's ignorance. "That rifle you were so concerned about, Colonel? It wasn't issued to her. She designed it. It's the prototype for the next generation of special operations sniper systems. That communications gear she used? It's a closed-loop, quantum-encrypted network that she herself developed to operate in environments where conventional comms are denied. This entire defensive network, the sensors you don't know about, the drone assets you've never seen, the contingency plans you've never read, she built it. You aren't the commander of this FOB, Colonel. You've just been a guest. You are standing on her chessboard." Each sentence was a hammer blow, systematically destroying the last vestiges of Thorne's reality. The narrator of this story could have stepped in then and listed her accomplishments, the litany of her legend. The Distinguished Service Cross she was awarded in a classified ceremony for actions in a country they were not officially in. The Presidential Medal of Freedom for single-handedly averting a geopolitical crisis by decrypting a terrorist network's communications in under an hour. The half-dozen patents in her name for technologies that had saved thousands of lives. The quiet, almost mythical reputation she held among the Tier 1 Special Operations units, who simply called her when things went catastrophically wrong. But the general's words were enough. He was the recognizer, the public validator of her true status, and his testimony was absolute. The woman, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed, finally looked up from her rifle. She gave General Mathis a small, almost imperceptible nod. "General, good to see you." The network held. "It always does, ma'am," Mathis replied, a hint of reverence in his voice. Then, her pale, analytical eyes moved to Colonel Thorne. He visibly flinched, as if she were aiming her weapon at him. The confrontation, interrupted by war, was about to be concluded. The aftermath of a battle is a strange, liminal space. The adrenaline recedes, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the stark, brutal clarity of survival. In the armory of Fob Sentinel, the air was still thick with the ghosts of violence, but a new, more personal tension had taken its place. General Mathis stood like a sentinel, his presence a clear signal that the old order was dead. The soldiers and armorers lingered, pretending to be busy with inventories and weapons checks, but their attention was focused entirely on the quiet drama unfolding in the center of the room. They were the chorus, the witnesses who would carry this story, this modern military fable, out into the wider world. Colonel Thorne was a man hollowed out. His skin was pale. His crisp uniform now seemed like a costume that was 2 sizes too big for him. His authority had been a fragile shell, and it had been shattered, first by the calm defiance of his intended victim, and then by the irrefutable truth of her identity. He stood before Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed, no longer a commander confronting a subordinate, but a fool awaiting judgment. Reed finished wiping down the last component of her rifle and began to reassemble it with the same unhurried precision as before. She did not look at Thorne as she spoke, her focus remaining on her work. Her voice was just as quiet, just as devoid of emotion. But now her words carried the immense weight of her revealed status. It was not the voice of anger or retribution. It was the voice of a clinical diagnosis, the calm assessment of a catastrophic failure. "Colonel," she began, her hands moving with fluid certainty, "your initial engagement with me was a tactical error of the first magnitude." She slotted the bolt into the carrier. "You operated from a position of flawed intelligence based on superficial data. You saw gender, you saw a lack of overt rank, and you perceived a subordinate. You failed to analyze the more critical data points presented to you. The specialized tool, the intense focus, the deliberate anonymity. Your prejudice created a blind spot, and you drove your authority directly into it." She paused, seating the reassembled bolt carrier group into the upper receiver. The metallic click was the only sound in the room. "Your second error was escalation. When your verbal assertion of dominance failed, you resorted to physical intimidation and an attempt to seize my equipment. This demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. You mistook a professional asset for a disciplinary problem. You were attempting to enforce a regulation without first understanding the context in which you were operating. You saw a violation of the rules, while I was, in fact, the author of a different, more important set of rules." General Mathis began to take a step forward, his expression hardening. He was preparing to verbally eviscerate Thorne, to strip the man of his career and his dignity right there on the concrete floor. "Colonel, you are a disgrace to that eagle you wear," he started to say, his voice a low growl. Reed held up a single hand, a small, quiet gesture that nonetheless stopped the two-star general in his tracks. "With respect, General," she said, not looking at him, "that will not be necessary." A murmur went through the onlookers. They had expected a reckoning, a brutal dressing down, perhaps the end of Thorne's career. They had expected punishment. But Reed was not interested in punishment. She was interested in education. She finally finished with her rifle, snapping the upper and lower receivers together with a final, definitive click. She looked directly at Thorne, her eyes holding his. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something beyond cold analysis in them. It was not pity. It was purpose. "The colonel will not be formally reprimanded," she stated. It was not a suggestion. It was an order of fact. A negative performance review would teach him only to be more cautious in his arrogance. A court-martial would make him a martyr in the eyes of others who share his flawed worldview. Neither outcome is productive. She turned to General Mathis. "General, with your permission, I am requesting an immediate administrative transfer. Colonel Thorne is to be reassigned." Mathis blinked, confused. "Reassigned? Ma'am, where? I'll send him to a desk in Greenland." "No," Reed said simply. "He will be reassigned to my unit, effective immediately. He will serve as my new executive officer." The silence that followed this declaration was more profound than the concussion of the first explosion. The idea was so audacious, so completely outside the bounds of conventional military justice, that no one knew how to react. To make the arrogant colonel the personal assistant to the woman he had tried to humiliate was a sentence more devastating, more complete, than any brig time. It was not punishment. It was a forced re-education. He would be stripped of his command, of his pride, of his very identity as an authority figure, and forced to witness, day in and day out, the quiet, overwhelming competence he had so foolishly challenged. He would learn respect not from a regulation, but from forced proximity to true mastery. Thorne's face went white as a sheet. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was being condemned not to a prison, but to a classroom where he would be the only failing student. Reed looked at him one last time. "Your education begins tomorrow at 0400, Colonel. Be on time. My team values punctuality." She picked up her rifle, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out of the armory into the smoke-filled dawn, leaving behind a humbled man, a stunned general, and the birth of a legend. And so the story of the day nightfall came to Phobe a Sentinel passed into the institutional lore of the United States military. Like all such stories, it grew and changed with each telling. In some versions, she fought off 100 insurgents single-handedly. In others, she called down lightning from a clear blue sky. But the core elements, the essential truths of the tale, remained unchanged. The arrogant colonel, the quiet professional, the sudden crisis, and the humbling, irrefutable demonstration of competence over rank. It became a modern fable, a teaching tool used by grizzled NCOs in dusty armories and sharp instructors in sterile classrooms to impart a lesson that no regulation could ever fully capture. Years passed. The wars in those distant, dusty lands waxed and waned. Phobe Sentinel itself was eventually dismantled, its concrete and steel returning to the landscape. But the legend endured. In a lecture hall at the National War College, where the future leaders of the military were forged, a guest lecturer stood before a class of bright, ambitious, and often arrogant young majors and lieutenant colonels. He was an older man now, his face lined with the hard-earned wisdom of experience. He wore the uniform of a colonel, but he wore it differently than he had all those years ago. The crispness was gone, replaced by a comfortable, lived-in quality. The arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, unwavering calm. His name was Marcus Thorne. He stood before the class, a remote in his hand, a tactical map of a nameless, theoretical battlefield on the screen behind him. He was widely regarded as one of the most effective instructors at the college, known for his uncanny ability to teach the nuances of asymmetric warfare and, more importantly, the character of true leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice quiet and measured, carrying a weight of authority that had been absent all those years ago. "We have spent this semester studying doctrine, strategy, and logistics. These are the sciences of war. But there is also an art to what we do. And the most important lesson in that art is this: the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is an assumption." He clicked the remote, and the map was replaced by a simple, grainy photograph of a nondescript woman in faded fatigues cleaning a rifle at a workbench. "Your rank," he continued, his eyes scanning the faces of his students, "is a grant of authority. It is not a guarantee of competence. Your uniform is a symbol of responsibility, not a shield of infallibility. The loudest voice in the room is often the most ignorant. True strength, true leadership, is not found in bluster or command. It is found in quiet competence. It is found in the relentless pursuit of mastery. It is found in the humility to recognize that you may not be the most qualified person in the room, regardless of what the insignia on your collar says." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said. "It's a story about a day I made a catastrophic tactical error. It was not an error of strategy or logistics. It was an error of character. I mistook an asset for a target. I saw gender and perceived a subordinate. I failed to analyze the data, and in doing so, I nearly compromised my command and my life. And so Colonel Marcus Thorne, the primary keeper of the legend, the living testament to its moral, began to tell the story of the day he met Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed. He told it not with shame, but with a strange kind of reverence. He used his own humiliation as the ultimate teaching tool, ensuring that the lesson he had learned so painfully would be passed on to the next generation of leaders. He had been her executive officer for 2 years, 2 years of grueling, humbling, and ultimately transformative education. He had learned more in that time than in his entire career before it. She had, in her own quiet, clinical way, remade him. The story, in the end, was not just about a colonel and a warrant officer. It was a parable for a larger truth. It was a reminder that substance will always, eventually, triumph over style. That action is the only true measure of worth. That the quiet professional, the hidden master, is the foundation upon which all successful enterprises are built. It is a lesson not just for the military, but for any organization, any community, any individual. Do not judge by appearances. Let your actions be your argument, for true authority is not taken, nor is it given by a title. It is the natural result of undeniable competence, and it radiates from those who have mastered their craft with a light that, sooner or later, cannot be ignored. The quiet ones, the focused ones, the ones who let their work speak for them. They are the ones who, when the crisis comes, will inherit the world.